When HBO announced A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, fans of George R.R. Martin's Westeros immediately started speculating about what kind of visual spectacle we'd be getting. After all, we've been conditioned by Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon to expect dragons soaring across battlefields, massive CGI armies clashing in epic confrontations, and visual effects budgets that would make most feature films jealous. But here's where things get interesting. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is taking a completely different approach, and it's not just a creative choice, it's a financial one too. HBO's head of drama, Francesca Orsi, revealed that A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms cost less than $10 million per episode, which is a fraction of what its predecessors required. To put that in perspective, House of the Dragon's first season cost under $20 million per episode, and Game of Thrones' final season was pushing similar numbers. We're talking about a show that's being made for roughly half the budget of House of the Dragon, yet Orsi claims the battle sequences match some of Game of Thrones' most iconic fight scenes. So how exactly is HBO pulling this off? The answer lies in a combination of storytelling philosophy, production innovation, and a return to the fundamentals of what made medieval fantasy compelling in the first place. Let's start by understanding what actually drives up production costs in shows like Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. The obvious culprit is dragons. Creating photorealistic dragons that can interact believably with actors, environments, and especially fire effects requires an enormous amount of computational power and artist hours. Every second of dragon screen time translates to weeks or even months of work from visual effects teams. The Spoils of War battle sequence in Game of Thrones Season 7 required about 7 or 8 months of work from a 100-person crew, and that was just for one episode featuring Drogon. House of the Dragon multiplied this challenge by featuring multiple dragons in almost every episode, each requiring individual character animation to maintain distinctive personalities and flying styles. But it's not just about the dragons themselves, it's about everything that comes with them. Dragon battles require extensive environment destruction, fire simulations, smoke effects, and digital doubles of actors for dangerous sequences. You need water simulations when dragons fly over the ocean, crowd simulations when they attack armies, and complex lighting scenarios to make everything blend seamlessly. The technical pipeline for a single dragon scene can involve dozens of different software packages and hundreds of individual shots that need to be rendered, composited, and color graded. It's a production nightmare that costs millions of dollars per episode. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms completely sidesteps this problem, not because of budget limitations, but because of when the story takes place. The show is set during a time when dragons are believed to be extinct, roughly a century before the events of Game of Thrones and well after the dragons have disappeared from Westeros. There are no White Walkers yet either, no massive supernatural threats that require extensive CGI creature work. The conflicts in this show are fundamentally human, knight against knight, sword against sword, honor against ambition. This isn't a limitation, it's a liberation. Think about what this means from a production standpoint. Without dragons, you don't need a massive visual effects team working around the clock. Without supernatural creatures, you don't need extensive creature design and animation pipelines. The battles don't require the costly elements that typically drive up a show's budget, which means HBO can focus resources on other aspects of production, practical sets, detailed costumes, real stunt work, and on-location filming. This is actually a return to how Game of Thrones operated in its early seasons, when the show built its reputation on political intrigue and character-driven drama rather than visual spectacle. The source material itself provides the blueprint for this approach. Tales of Dunk and Egg is a series of fantasy novellas by George R.R. Martin that follow the adventures of Dunk and his squire Egg some 90 years before the events of the novels. These stories were never about grand political machinations or world-ending threats. They're intimate character studies about a hedge knight trying to live up to the ideals of chivalry in a world that often doesn't reward such nobility. Critics have highlighted the protagonist's relatable humanity as a refreshing contrast to the more cynical figures in A Song of Ice and Fire, and this ground-level perspective naturally requires less CGI spectacle. What's fascinating is how showrunner Ira Parker has embraced this difference as a creative advantage rather than viewing it as a constraint. Parker explained that Dunk is plain and simple and to the point. He doesn't have a lot of flash to him, and the show's aesthetic reflects this philosophy. The series opens without the customary elaborate title sequence that Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon are known for. Instead, viewers get a simple title card in medieval-inspired font. It's a statement of intent. This show isn't trying to compete with the grandeur of its predecessors. It's offering something fundamentally different. Parker described the overall tone as having a grounded attitude closer to the grit of medieval life than to high fantasy spectacle, saying this could basically be 14th century Britain. That comparison is crucial for understanding the production approach. Medieval period dramas have been made successfully for decades without relying on extensive CGI. Shows like The Last Kingdom and films like Outlaw King have proven that you can create compelling medieval warfare using primarily practical effects, real armor, actual stunt work, and clever cinematography. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is following this blueprint, using HBO's expertise in period production to create authenticity rather than spectacle. The battle sequences are a perfect example of this philosophy in action. Orsi assured that despite the smaller budget, the scale of the battles remains on par with some of Game of Thrones' most iconic fight sequences. How is this possible? By focusing on what actually makes battle sequences compelling: choreography, stakes, character investment, and visceral physicality. Some of the most memorable battles in Game of Thrones weren't the ones with the biggest CGI budgets. The Battle of the Bastards worked because of its claustrophobic intensity and innovative camera work. The fight between the Mountain and the Viper was memorable because of the emotional investment and brutal choreography, not because of visual effects. Modern filmmaking has actually proven that practical effects often create more impactful combat sequences than CGI-heavy alternatives. Films like The Last Duel and The Northman have shown that with proper choreography, real armor, and skilled stunt performers, you can create medieval combat that feels more authentic and viscerally impactful than any amount of digital enhancement. The weight of real swords, the clanging of actual metal armor, the physical exhaustion visible on actors' faces, these elements create a sense of reality that CGI struggles to replicate. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is betting that audiences will respond to this authenticity. The smaller scale of the story also plays to these strengths. Unlike Game of Thrones with its sprawling ensemble cast and multiple storylines, or House of the Dragon with its dynastic political intrigue, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms centers on just two main characters, Dunk and Egg. This focused narrative means the show doesn't need to cut between dozens of different locations, each requiring its own sets, visual effects work, and production resources. Instead, the first season will be largely set at the tourney at Ashford Meadow, allowing the production team to invest deeply in making one location feel completely real and lived in. This concentration of resources has historical precedent in HBO's own catalog. The first season of Game of Thrones operated on a relatively modest budget of around $6 million per episode, far less than later seasons. Yet many fans consider those early seasons to be the show's creative peak precisely because the limited budget forced the writers to focus on character, dialogue, and political intrigue rather than relying on visual spectacle. The iconic scenes from Season 1, Ned's execution, Tyrion's trial, the revelation of Jon's parentage, none of these required extensive CGI. They worked because of writing, performance, and emotional investment. George R.R. Martin himself has embraced this approach for A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms. Martin posted on his blog that the series will be a lot shorter than Game of Thrones or House of the Dragon with a much different tone. He's also been remarkably candid about what the show won't have. Martin stated there are no dragons this time around, no huge battles, no White Walkers. This is a character piece focused on duty and honor and chivalry. For an author whose books are famous for their massive scale and complexity, this is a significant pivot, and it's one that naturally requires less CGI infrastructure. The tonal shift is equally important for understanding the reduced CGI needs. The series attempts to achieve a lighter, optimistic feel, which is a major departure from the grim darkness that characterized much of Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. This lighter tone doesn't just mean more humor and less death, it means a different visual language. The oppressive, desaturated color palettes that worked for Game of Thrones' political backstabbing don't make sense for a story about a hopeful young knight trying to do right in the world. You don't need elaborate CGI environments to convey darkness and dread when your story is fundamentally about hope and honor. HBO's growing expertise in producing fantasy television has also made this reduced budget possible. A production insider explained that HBO is now so adept at world-building series through years of producing Game of Thrones, Westworld, and his Dark Materials that the team can make a high-quality series as efficiently and effectively as possible. This institutional knowledge is invaluable. The production teams know which visual effects vendors to work with, which practical effect techniques work best for medieval combat, and how to maximize the impact of every dollar spent. They've learned from a decade of trial and error. Consider what this learning curve means in practical terms. When Game of Thrones started in 2010, the visual effects industry was still figuring out how to do television scale fantasy. Each season involved reinventing workflows, discovering new techniques, and learning from expensive mistakes. By the time House of the Dragon entered production, HBO had a playbook for exactly how to create Westeros on screen. They knew which medieval locations in Europe worked best for filming, which costume workshops could deliver authentic period armor, and which stunt coordinators could choreograph believable sword fights. All of this accumulated knowledge makes every subsequent production more efficient. The shift away from CGI-heavy production also reflects broader industry trends. After years of Marvel movies and blockbuster franchises relying heavily on digital effects, there's growing audience appetite for practical filmmaking. Directors like Christopher Nolan have built entire careers on prioritizing practical effects over CGI, and audiences have responded enthusiastically. Films like Oppenheimer prove that you don't need extensive visual effects to create compelling cinema. Similarly, television shows that embrace practical production techniques often generate more positive word of mouth than their CGI-heavy counterparts. This trend is partly driven by audience sophistication. Modern viewers have seen enough bad CGI to recognize when something looks artificial. We've all watched scenes where characters clearly aren't interacting with their environment, where lighting doesn't match between practical and digital elements, or where physics simply don't work correctly. These moments break immersion and remind viewers they're watching a constructed fiction. Practical effects, especially for something as grounded as medieval combat, simply look and feel more real because they are real. The economic realities of modern television production also favor this approach. Streaming services and traditional networks alike are tightening budgets as subscription growth slows and competition intensifies. HBO's parent company, Warner Bros. Discovery, is dealing with substantial debt and actively looking for ways to reduce costs without sacrificing quality. Orsi described the budgetary challenges as a lesson for HBO in the need to be challenging these budgets. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms represents a test case for whether prestige fantasy television can succeed at a more sustainable price point. If the show succeeds both critically and commercially at this reduced budget level, it could reshape HBO's entire approach to fantasy programming. Many viewers may wonder if these changes could have further ramifications for how future Game of Thrones productions are approached. The network has multiple other Westeros projects in development, including shows about Aegon's conquest, the sea snake Corlys Velaryon, and potentially others. If A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms proves that audiences will embrace a more grounded, less CGI-dependent approach to this world, it gives HBO a viable template for expanding the franchise without bankrupting themselves. The character focus of the show also naturally reduces CGI requirements in ways that aren't immediately obvious. When you're following the journey of just two characters, you don't need elaborate establishing shots of dozens of different castles and cities. You don't need massive crowd simulations for throne room scenes with hundreds of courtiers. You don't need digital matte paintings to extend sets beyond what can be practically built. The story takes a more grounded look at Westeros, following a lowly hedge knight rather than a noble angling for the Iron Throne. Dunk and Egg spend most of their time traveling on foot or horseback, staying in small inns, and interacting with common people, none of which requires expensive visual effects. This ground-level perspective on Westeros is actually one of the most exciting aspects of the show from a world-building standpoint. Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon have shown us the great halls and throne rooms, the massive fortresses and royal courts, but we've rarely seen the everyday life of common people in this world. What do villages look like? How do ordinary people dress, eat, and live? What does it mean to be a hedge knight traveling from tournament to tournament, hoping to find work. These are the kinds of details that make a fantasy world feel real and lived in, and they're details you explore through production design and practical filming rather than CGI. The tournament setting of the first season is particularly well suited to this practical approach. Medieval tournaments were real historical events, and we have extensive documentation about how they worked, what they looked like, and how they were organized. Production designers can draw on this historical record to create an authentic tournament ground without needing to invent fantastical architecture from scratch. The jousting, melee combat, and pageantry of a tournament are all things that can be staged practically with period-accurate armor, real horses, and skilled stunt performers. It's the kind of sequence that actually benefits from not being CGI. When viewers see a knight in real armor getting knocked off a real horse by a real lance, the impact is visceral in a way that digital effects can never quite match. The show's lighter tone also opens up different narrative possibilities that don't require extensive visual effects. Martin told Collider that it's a little softer, a little more humorous, and he hopes the audience will be open to that kind of change. Humor is one of the hardest things to achieve with CGI-heavy production because comedy relies on precise timing, physical performance, and often improvisation, all of which are difficult when actors are performing against green screens or tennis balls on sticks representing dragons. By keeping things practical and grounded, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms gives its actors the freedom to develop chemistry and timing organically. The comparison to other successful fantasy shows is instructive here. The Witcher on Netflix has massive CGI budgets for monsters and magic, but many fans feel the show works best in its quieter character moments. The Mandalorian proved that even in the Star Wars universe, audiences respond to focused character stories with practical aliens and puppetry alongside the CGI. Lord of the Rings of Power had one of the most expensive production budgets in television history, but received mixed reviews partly because the spectacle overshadowed character development. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is betting that intimate storytelling will resonate more deeply than visual excess. There's also something to be said for creative constraints breeding innovation. Some of the most memorable sequences in television history came about because producers couldn't afford to do what they originally envisioned. The Battle of Blackwater in Game of Thrones was significantly scaled back from what was planned, but the creative team compensated with clever cinematography, focused character moments, and practical fire effects that made the sequence feel enormous despite the limited scope. When you can't throw money at a problem through CGI, you have to find creative solutions, and often those solutions are more interesting than the original plan. The stunt work and fight choreography become even more crucial in this environment. The series has emphasized the director's efforts in bringing battles to life while reinvigorating the franchise's battles without compromising due to the smaller budget. This means investing in world-class fight coordinators, giving stunt performers adequate rehearsal time, and capturing the action with skilled cinematography. It's a different allocation of resources, less money to visual effects houses in post-production, more money to stunt teams and practical effects on set. But the result can be more immediate and impactful for viewers. Looking at the creative team behind the show provides additional confidence in this approach. Showrunner Ira Parker has spoken extensively about his vision for a more grounded Westeros. The directors attached to the project have experience with character-driven drama and practical action. The casting of Peter Claffey as Dunk emphasizes physicality. He's a large actor who can actually perform the stunts and sword work necessary for a hedge knight. Dexter Saul Ansel as Egg brings youth and energy to the role without needing to rely on CGI de-aging or enhancement. These are choices that prioritize practical performance over digital manipulation. The production locations also favor this practical approach. Filming in Northern Ireland, where much of Game of Thrones was shot, gives it production access to medieval architecture, natural landscapes, and established filming infrastructure. Unlike House of the Dragon, which often requires extensive set extensions to create the more fantastical Valyrian architecture of earlier eras, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms can use real medieval castles and towns with minimal digital enhancement. A stone fortress is a stone fortress, whether it was built in the 14th century or the fictional 2nd century AC. The costume and production design can also embrace historical authenticity in ways that reduce costs. Real medieval armor and clothing can be researched, replicated, and worn by actors without requiring digital touch-ups. When everything from helmets to swords to boots is based on historical precedent, you don't need artists spending months designing fantastical new styles that then need to be digitally refined. The Dunk and Egg novellas are deliberately less fantastical than the main Song of Ice and Fire series, and this translates directly to production savings. Music and sound design also play into this equation in interesting ways. The iconic Game of Thrones theme by Ramin Djawadi is bombastic and orchestral, befitting a show about kingdoms at war. Parker noted that Ramin Djawadi's score is orchestral and large and beautiful, but that's not really Dunk's MO, suggesting the musical approach will be more intimate and character-focused. This isn't just an aesthetic choice. Large orchestral scores are expensive to produce and record. A more folk-inflected, smaller ensemble score costs less and can actually be more effective for intimate storytelling. The reduced episode count also factors into the budget equation. A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms first season consists of 6 episodes rather than the 8 or 10 episode seasons typical of Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. Fewer episodes means the budget per episode can be higher even with a lower overall season budget. It also means the production can maintain quality control more easily, ensuring every frame meets standards without the exhausting grind of producing 10 hours of premium television in a compressed time frame. This efficiency extends to post-production as well. Visual effects work is notoriously time-consuming, often requiring months of iteration and refinement. A show with minimal CGI requirements can turn around episodes much faster, allowing for tighter feedback loops between production and post-production teams. This can actually improve quality. When editors and directors can see finished scenes quickly, they can make better decisions about pacing, performance, and storytelling rather than waiting months to see how a CGI-heavy sequence turned out. The marketing and audience expectations are also being carefully managed. HBO has been transparent about what A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is and isn't. They're not promising dragon battles or massive armies clashing. They're positioning it as a character study, an intimate look at honor and friendship in a dangerous world. This honesty helps set appropriate expectations. Viewers who tune in looking for the spectacle of House of the Dragon will be disappointed, but viewers who appreciate character-driven storytelling will find exactly what they're looking for. Ultimately, the reduced CGI in A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms represents a creative evolution rather than a limitation. By embracing practical filmmaking, character focus, and historical authenticity, the show can deliver compelling fantasy television at a more sustainable price point. If it succeeds, it proves that you don't need dragons and massive CGI budgets to tell engaging stories in Westeros. Sometimes a knight, a squire, and the moral code they struggle to uphold are all you need. The true test will come when the show premieres and audiences respond. Will viewers embrace this more grounded approach to Westeros? Will the absence of dragons feel like a loss or a refreshing change of pace? Can practical medieval combat and character drama hold attention spans trained on CGI spectacle? These questions will determine not just the fate of A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, but potentially the future direction of fantasy television as a whole. In an industry increasingly focused on sustainability and efficiency, proving that less can indeed be more might be the most revolutionary thing this show accomplishes.